Welcome everyone to the closing ceremony of the Research Transparency Campaign. As part of the Open Science Initiative, this campaign was intended to bring awareness of pre-registration and open research practices necessary to ensure transparency in the research workflow. The campaign is a collaboration between ERIM, Erasmus University Library, and the Erasmus Research Services. My name is Liz Guzman-Ramirez, and I will be your host. I am the Research Data Steward for RSM and ESE. And together with Mutaleni Nadimi, the project manager of the University Library, and Antonio Esquetino, the Open Science Coordinator of the Erasmus Research Services, we're very happy to welcome you to this session and this closing session of the whole campaign. Also, if you're interested in open science, please consider joining the Open Science Community Rotterdam, where researchers and support staff help each other in learning, discussing, and adopting open science practices. And for more information, please have a look at the link that will be shared in the chat. We are honored today to be joined by Dr. Matthijs van Otegem. He's the director of the Erasmus University Library, and by Professor Pursey Heugens, the scientific director of ERIM and Dean of Research for RSM. We will start the session with a few words from Matthijs. So, Matthijs, the floor is yours. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, Liz. And actually, it's an honor to be allowed to say something at the closing of this wonderful campaign on open science and pre-registration. And actually, I like to start with a short experience I had in my own research ages ago. My topic is the history of philosophy. It's not a topic you associate with hypotheses, pre-registration, data sets. And indeed, well, the way I used to do research was you have an idea, you start looking in literature, you go to a conference, you pitch your idea, then you write an article, sometimes you get some feedback, and ultimately you lay down your ideas in this big fat book, which is the highest goal, at least in my field. And then one day I got an invite for a conference, and this was entirely different. I used to measure success at the number of attendees at a conference, how many people you can reach. And at this conference, only 30 people were invited. And they were all presenters. And there was one topic, the radical enlightenment. So think of René Descartes, Spinoza, the highlights in Western Europe, 17th century. And all researchers had one particular angle. Mine was mass communication in the 17th century. How does it work? What are the economics of the printing office? And you were expected to write out your paper and publish it beforehand. Just put it on the website even before the conference for everyone to see. And at the conference, you only got 5 minutes to comment on your own paper, and then it was up for discussions. I thought, wow, this is wonderful, because everybody can read it. And you don't waste time just presenting what's in your paper. You can immediately have the discussions. And what I didn't expect, but what happened actually was that I got discussions with people all over the world, because people were looking at this website for this very topic. And I got lots of questions by email, lots of comments. So when I wrote my paper, I could already integrate all these comments and make it far better than I would have been able myself in my own study. Without having this feedback from my colleagues. And I must say that actually this paper is the most used in education of all the papers I wrote as a researcher. I thought, wow, this is terrific. It's not only about research, but it's also about the impact you can have with your ideas, not only within the research community, but also in education. And I think these two should be closely connected. And then, well, I didn't stay on as a researcher. I'd rather be a librarian. And as a librarian, I can help people with open science. We are the content manager of the university. But actually this experience and this story, I always keep in mind, because there's so many researchers, there's so many different kinds of research. We're not always the same animal. There are many varieties of research. And that's what we should keep in our minds when we're developing open science. We're discussing pre-registration. And that's why I'm so happy about this campaign, and especially about the way how we do this, because this is a clear collaboration between the faculty ERIM, Erasmus Research Services, the library, And we're all in it together. And we're all focused on how can we help our researchers? How can we make the difference? And that's what I particularly like about this campaign. And I really admire ERIM and Pursey for taking the lead in this way of working. And actually, I hope that this campaign is a pivot between previous ERIM campaigns and more university-wide campaigns in open science. And it's not a coincidence that we took this topic, pre-registration, because actually that's what our researchers gave back in a survey, where they see room for improvement. And that's the way I like to work with you, and I like to continue. So I'm very grateful to the team, Mutaleni, Antonio, and Liz, who did a tremendous effort in organizing this week, and you really made waves. And I think you set an example for the near future to continue. So thank you so much that I could kick off this closing ceremony. Keep up the good work, and I'm really looking forward to Pursey's presentation on the pre-registration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Matthijs. I'm going to share my screen to give the floor to Pursey.
And I'm going to request control.
I think I already gave it to you. Right? Can you try to click on the screen?
I'll try. I'll request again.
Okay.
You denied it to me, but
sorry.
And I'm sorry, everyone, but we're almost there. One more time, and otherwise I'm going to ask you to click, Liz.
I don't get the request though. Are you requesting it?
I am requesting it, but I don't get it. But it doesn't really matter.
Okay, I'll go through it.
If you mind clicking, then that would be great.
No problem.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Matthijs, for your lovely introduction and for sharing such a personal story. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experiences as an editor in terms of how pre-registration can be a force for the good and what functions it actually plays in the peer review process. And as many of you who know me, I like to keep things light a little, so I will not use too much brimstone and fire here, but I will finish with something of a message for all of us, something that we can work on going forward. So I would say let's move over to the next slide, Liz. So what are we going to do today? I would like to start briefly, and many of you are either in research or you have definitely started your careers as researchers. And so I would like you to play along nicely, so to speak. And I'm going to start with a brief self-diagnostic test. And hold on to the score that you're going to get there or the label that you're going to get. And we're going to debrief a little bit later on today. Then I would like to go to one of my messages, and that's what functions does pre-registration have in the peer review process? And I think that we can roughly distinguish between two kinds of benefits, two kinds of functions that pre-registration has, right? I mean, there clearly are epistemic benefits, the benefits that pre-registration brings to the practice of science. But a lot of the campaign has already been spent on those benefits. What I will do today is that I will focus in particular on the functions of pre-registration in the peer review process, bringing in the perspective of what it does from the perspective of the editor in order to arrive at good decisions with respect to the publication or not of a manuscript, but also primarily how to pull manuscripts forward in a constructive way through the peer review process and what role pre-registration plays in those. Then I'm going to debrief you on the self-diagnostic test. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to make a couple of brief comments about more programmatic versus less programmatic research traditions. I'll tell you a little bit about what I mean with that a little bit further on. But the point that I'm going to make, and that is a bit of a sensitive point, is that pre-registration as we know it in its more orthodox forms is certainly way more beneficial or way more accepted within the more programmatic research traditions. Whereas in the social sciences, every of the social sciences also has non-programmatic research traditions. And then the question is, what do we do then? Do we throw pre-registration out like the proverbial baby with the bathwater, or is there a way to salvage it? And that's going to be my conclusion that we all need to engage in a search for epistemic neutrality. And with that, I mean forms of open science practices, and in this particular case of pre-registration practices in particular, that work for all of us as a community and not just for the more programmatic fields in the social sciences. But let's dive right in, and I'm going to ask you to give it a 1-2 punch, the self-diagnostic test. Onto the next slide. You all know your self-diagnostic test, so this is just to prime you with the trauma that you have all lived through over the last 2 years. But let's go to the next slide, and then here we go. I'm going to, in total, show you roughly 10 questions. Not roughly, but exactly 10 questions. And what I'm going to ask you is that I'm going to read these statements to you. So follow my cue. But what I want you to do is to simply count along with the number of yeses that you have. So at the end of the day, you're going to end up with a score between 0 and 10. For most of you that either have 10 fingers or 10 digits, if keeping score in your head, then just away from the screen, just count on your fingers, I would say. Good, here we go. So take your own field of science, and especially your own, and don't just think management or econ or sociology in general, but think about your, if you're in family sociology, think about family sociology. If you're in OB, think about OB. If you're in industrial organization economics, completely random topic, of course, but then by all means, keep that field in mind and think along with me with these 10 statements. First of all, in my field, so in my niche, research is mostly deductive. So if we have a hypothesis, if we're going to test hypotheses, they must always derive from established theories. If theories also can be arrived at non-deductively, or if you don't have hypotheses at all, then don't give yourself a point, but give yourself a point if you agree with the statement. Secondly, in my field, there is a fair degree of agreement as to what the most pressing unsolved research problems are. So if there's a community of scientists and we ask them what are the problems that we ought to be working on, then within my field there's a fair degree of consensus as to what those remaining research problems are. Third, researchers working for other research groups in my area. So in my niche, there's other great research groups in Asia, in Europe, in North America, perhaps elsewhere, perhaps in Latin America. And if they are well-trained researchers, they're not immediately interchangeable, but they could have been fitted into my team with relative ease because they share paradigms, they share methods, they share data. And if that is the case, give yourself a point, otherwise abstain. Fourth, the majority of research studies in my area are in a sense incremental, in the sense that they push for extensions of known theories or frameworks, right? A radical innovation, if you're honest, is not necessarily needed for most publications, but incremental extensions of frameworks go down really smoothly, so to speak. Give yourself a point if you agree. If you are more radical, if you are in a more rebellious nick of the woods, then please abstain. 5, I work within a strong research paradigm. There's good consensus about what the assumptions are, about what the main theories are, about what the dominant ways of working are. So in a Kuhnian sense, if you are a philosopher of science like Matthijs, then I work within a strong paradigm. If you agree, then give yourself a point, and otherwise abstain. You guys doing good? We're already halfway, so keep up the motivation, and let's go to the next slide. 5 more to go. If you, in your community, if researchers stumble upon anomalies, right? So if they find stuff that refutes prior theories, so that entire cherished framework of studies that has brought us all where we are, then people freak out, right? So in principle, if you don't watch out, a gatekeeping machinery kicks into gear. And let's put it mildly here, counter-hypothesized results are scrutinized much more intensively than framework or theory confirming results. If that is the case, give yourself a point. If your field is a bunch of happy-go-luckies that really loves counter-hypothesized results, then please abstain. 4 more to go. My field has well-defined schools of thought. So these are kind of self-regulatory communities with pretty strong epistemic views on how studies must be conducted. So I'm not saying that all studies are interchangeable, but all studies are somewhat formulaic in the sense that they form or follow a pretty strong recipe of how you should set up your experiments, about how you should analyze your data, etc., etc. Then 8, in my field, there's a very strong, pretty strong methodological consensus, in the sense that there's a core set of empirical methods that kind of undergirds most of the research studies in my field. So the number of empirical methods is not infinite, but there's a fair degree of consensus on what works and what doesn't if you're analyzing data. Then 9 and 10, we're almost there, folks, so you're doing really good. Researchers in my area are all working with a limited number of well-known data sets, or at least work with highly comparable data. If everyone would agree as to what data is, if that is non-controversial, if the data sets that people work with are limited in number, but they're massive, they are important for everyone, give yourself a point, otherwise abstain. And finally, 10, if you look at the top schools in my field and you look at how they train their PhD students, then there's a fair degree of convergence. There's a fair degree of isomorphism as to how PhDs are being trained. Good. Then, by all means, count the number of fingers that you have up, and you should be somewhere in the range of 0 and 10, or you are not practicing Euclidean math, but that's okay too. But you should be between 0 and 10. Let's move to the next slide, Liz, and see what this all means. How many points did you score? Was it fewer than 5, between 5 and 7, or 8 or more? I'm going to give you a code name, and the code name is important for the debrief. So let's go down one more slide, and there is it. If you are fewer than 5, your code name is Labrador, Golden Retriever. If you're between 5 and 7, so scratch the Labrador, should be Golden Retriever. My bad, they're both yellowish. If you're in between, you're a Border Collie, and if you are 8 or more, then I'm going to give you the code name German Shepherd. I know that some people are super offended by this. I see that smoke and fumes are coming out of the ears of especially Antonio. So there's an equivalent if you're a cat person, right? I mean, for the sake of inclusivity. So if you are fewer than 5, I'm going to give you, obviously, the most sociable of all cats, the Siamese. If you are between 5 and 7, I'm going to give you the smartest of all cats, the Burmese. And if you're 8 or more, I'm going to give you the best Mauser of all cats, and that's the Siberian, right? So these are your alternative code names if you want to keep on to those for the debrief. Let's move on, Liz, and let's have a bit of an intermezzo, maybe the mainstay of today, but if you are an editor, right? If you are, if your job is essentially to fill journals, right? I mean, many people believe that as an editor, your job is to deny everyone access. In reality, we're always super anxious that actually journals need to be filled, and some journals have a super big backlog, others really don't, or on a much tighter clock. So believe it or not, when I say it, but we are happy with every paper that we can shepherd through the like a Border Collie through the review process. But shepherding through the review process sometimes can become difficult, right? Because deadlocks or gridlocks emerge, because it's not always clear where a paper is going, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say that here, as in some fields already a very widely utilized, in other fields an underutilized tool, the pre-registration mechanism comes in really handy. So what are some of the functions in the peer review process? Before we go this, I've been doing this for a while. I've been an editor at 3 journals. I've decisioned over 300 manuscripts, and I've done that for quantitative and qualitative research as well as for theory papers. And theoretically, I'm quite heterodox, so I do think that I have made decisions kind of spanning the entire spectrum, if you wish, of things to be decided in the broader social sciences. But let's not move on. This is not about me. Let's move on to what then these functions are. I would say there's 4 functions that from an editorial perspective, pre-registration actually brings to the table. It's an important virtue signal. And I'm going to give you a non-cynical reading of what virtue signals are. They can be an important tiebreaker, and I'll give you one example of a paper that I think where pre-registration saved the day for that paper, a paper that I had the privilege of editing. It can also be an important self-binding advice to fight off the urge to go for ever more robustness checks, ever more data points, etc. And it can be a theoretical point of departure, and then we'll also lunge us into how pre-registration isn't really used currently that much, but how, especially for the more interpretivist traditions, it can make an important difference going forward in the future. So these are the 4 functions. Let's go to the first. And let's look at the idea of a virtue signal, right? Many of you may be familiar with the theory around virtue signaling. And if you're not in a theoretical sense, then by all means, the fact that everyone is currently, of course, donning a Ukrainian flag gives you an idea what virtue signals are. Virtue signals, of course, do not in a direct sense better the lives of everyone living in the Ukraine right now. At the same time, it does signal a few things, right? It does signal that you are, I don't know, against autocracies, that you are against atrocities, that you respect the democratic rights of free people, that you stand with the Ukrainians, and all of that is important. But these are, at the end of the day, signals rather than material action. Pre-registration, oftentimes in the peer review process, as one of its functions, plays exactly the role as a virtue signal. So the question is, what does it signal when you choose to pre-register your hypotheses or research design or observation plan? It signals a few things, right? I mean, to your editor and to your reviewers, especially where it's still voluntary to do so. It signals that you are committed to scientific integrity, that you are against harking, hypothesizing after the results are known, that you respect facts even if they will go against my cherished ideas, and that in general, that you are a virtuous scientist. So this may lead you to the idea that this is a cynical view, but I would say it is not. Virtue signaling is important in science. First of all, one thing that it does is that it helps us all collectively to invoke what sociologists call the doctrine of good faith. And without that doctrine of good faith, if we had to scrutinize every data point, if we had to scrutinize every line of code, reviewing a paper would cost us 2 weeks rather than the 3 hours that we now spend on it. And so without the doctrine of good faith, the entire peer review process would break down. So in principle, virtue signaling is important. Another reason to not be against virtue signaling is that it raises the reputational stakes for the research team involved, right? I mean, you make yourself vulnerable by emitting the sense that you want to be virtuous. And in that sense, these reputational stakes are real, and they do buttress this doctrine of good faith. And finally, what I would say is that if this leads people, if people seek virtue signaling for more instrumental reasons, but as a corollary to that, they do list more of their hypotheses and more of their research designs upfront, then at the end of the day, we are still ending up with a more complete verification chain, and that is valuable irrespective of researcher intention. So systematically, virtue signaling is nothing to sneeze at. But there are other functions. And a second one that I would say, and this can be important, is also as a tiebreaker. Right? I mean, in an ideal peer review process, all reviewers are aligned as to what the issues in the manuscript are, and if it's ideal from the researcher's perspective, they're not only aligned, but they're also positive enough to say, well, work it out and see what happens. And the guidance that they give is commensurable, right? It all adds up. It all results in actionable advice. Now, luckily for us, right, the ideal peer review process is certainly not a unicorn in the sense that this beast does exist, and it happens quite a bit in all honesty, but the combination of constructive, but at the same time also incommensurable advice. So all your reviewers want or the majority of your reviewers want the manuscript to proceed, but how to make it better on that issue they may not be aligned. That also unfortunately happens quite a bit. And then if that happens, the pre-registration of hypotheses, experiments, or robustness checks during the review process to essentially say, well, this is going to be kind of like the truth. So this is going to be the negotiated environment. I want you to do this, this, and that. And then we'll publish it no matter where the evidence takes it, or we'll push you around further, irrespective of where the evidence takes it. This can actually help to get a review process that has remained or that has become stuck, unstuck again. And what I would say is that, now this is important for you to the extent that you are still active authors. This can be editor initiated, but it's also perfectly fine if you as an author suggest to use the pre-registration process as a tiebreaker yourself. One click further will show you one example of a paper, and I think it's a great paper, by the way, which actually in round 2 got completely stuck in the peer review process. And then we collectively suggested to actually have a kind of like a critical experiment for the body of the theory. Before that data was collected, it was hand-collected data and took time to collect. We communicated this outside of the official channels to all reviewers and got buy-in. That experiment really cut the tie, and from that point onward, the next round, the manuscript actually was easy to accept. But this is a manuscript for which a tiebreaker really was needed in order to get the review process unstuck, because the promise of the manuscript was certainly there. But we actually painted ourselves in a corner halfway through the review process. So the tiebreaker function is important, and it can be used at various stages and by various and initiated by many along the peer review process. 2 more lists to keep the tempo up. The third thing that I would say is that pre-registration can also serve as a self-binding device. Right, so we as people or as groups of people are all to a certain extent prone to akrasia, right? So cravings that we cannot resist. And when people face the urge to eat kilograms of chocolate, like myself, or other things, they tend to self-bind, right? So some of you may have put the alarm clock across the room from your bed, says you have to get out of bed to put it to a halt in the morning. Or when you're in the supermarket, you may actually buy small portions of your favorite candy in order not to eat a kilogram of it on Saturday night, but to spread it out over the entire week. Or rather than say, well, I'm going to exercise alone, you make exercise appointments with your friends, public commitment to exercise with them, in the hope that that will get you out more for the jog than when you are supposed to go out by yourself when there's a chance of rain. Now, these are classic philosophical examples, but why bring them up? Because the peer review process itself is also prone to similar forms of akrasia, right? I mean, anyone who has been involved in the peer review process knows that there's always room for another robustness check, always room for one more control variable, or for more data points. And pre-registration can also be a way of tying your reviewers to the proverbial mast, right? I mean, the classic example, but this is because Gisula is with us, of course, is that Odysseus tied himself to the mast, or let his men tie himself to the mast so that he could hear the sirens without falling victim to them. Pre-registration serves the same philosophical example. It's pre-commitment to a set of hypotheses, to an observation plan, or to a certain power analysis that actually kind of brings everyone on board and says that if you do this, it's enough upfront, rather than that there's always the ex post settling up or the ex post haggling about the additional data points or the additional control variables. And in this sense, pre-registration can be an important self-binding advice that puts limits on what we ask authors to do during the peer review process. And as data sets over the years in the social sciences have grown larger and larger, and as the sections of robustness checks have also grown larger and larger, everyone in the field realizes that this is very, very necessary, right? We need to be realistic about what is the type of work that needs to be done for a single article, and then also collectively move on to the next. Final one, Liz, from my side, is that pre-registration can also be a point of departure. And after this, we are going to debrief your exercise. So at first blush, what I would say, for many research designs that are kind of off the hypothetico-deductive cycle, and roughly half of my work is qualitative, ethnographic, and interpretivist, then pre-registration may not be an immediate or intuitive choice. So most abductive or inductive or interpretative study designs do not start with a finite set of hypotheses. And if you actually try to then register your research online, if you go to, for example, to Wharton's As Predicted, you find out that that has a pretty dominant hypothetico-deductive flavor, right? I mean, it talks about hypotheses, it wants you to register a dependent variable, it wants you to register your experimental conditions, and all of that is good and dandy, but it really doesn't work if you are an interpretivist person. At the same time, I do think that if you are a qualitative researcher, it is, but also if you are in one of the less programmatic research traditions, we'll get there in a minute during the debrief, but it is super important to put down your point of departure and to pre-register, if you wish, your theoretical priors. And why is that the case? Because if you know where you start, or where the start of the analysis and the theorizing process was, then it also becomes easier to understand the journey towards the end product. In reality, what we see in most qualitative work right now is that we do document the end product, but we don't document the journey of reanalyzing, recollecting data, reinterpreting the entire model, re-interviewing our key informants as we move from our initial theoretical ideas to the theoretical ideas that ultimately see light of day in print. And so pre-registering your point of departure is crucial, I would say, to the transparency, the traceability, and the reconstitutability of the analysis process in the less programmatic research traditions. But, and this is going to be my final plea in just a couple of minutes, this is also where we have, as a community of scholars, still most work to do, so to speak. So let's go to the debrief. Remember your number, right? And remember your cue. But what I would say is that the score that you have given me earlier on is kind of essential for understanding the difference between programmatic versus less programmatic research traditions. Let's move on, Liz, and see where this takes us. So what I would say is that all across the social sciences, you have more programmatic research, and there's tons of non-programmatic research, right? It's not the case that one community is necessarily larger than the other. And it's not necessarily, if you are in macro management, for example, that the left-hand side is OB and right-hand side is strategy. It's not that simple. If you go down to the more micro communities, then you see programmatic micro communities and non-programmatic micro communities everywhere. But what makes research programmatic? A programmatic research typically has dominant theories from which new hypotheses are deduced. In non-programmatic research, that kind of thrives on theoretical contestation, and dispute actually fuels progress. There's a lot of consensus on grand challenges on the left-hand panel, whereas there's a lot of dissensus on the future research agenda on the right-hand panel. Training and experiences of scientists are quite similar on the left-hand side. You can understand the corollary on the right-hand side. But also, there's a lot of self-censorship into which methods are being emerged as acceptable, right? For example, in macro management, we all know the identification police or the endogeneity police. That may not be as strict, and there may be more methodological heterodoxy on the right-hand panel. What counts as data is non-controversial on the right-hand panel, on the left-hand panel, right? A few data sets, oftentimes very curated data sets that are accessible to all, whereas there's a large premium on bringing in new data on the right-hand panel. Counter-hypothesized results versus can elicit gatekeeping behavior, whereas oftentimes they are celebrated, sometimes even a bit too often for their novelty on the right-hand panel. I think that these are both extremes, right? But counter-hypothesized results can elicit gatekeeping behavior, and that is unwarranted, but that's the tragedy of programmatic research. The tragedy of non-programmatic results is essentially that non-findings or weak findings are often celebrated for their novelty because they are seen as the best thing since sliced bread. Neither of them is great, but both research traditions have their flaws, so to speak. And so the left-hand side, programmatic means paradigmatic, pre, post, or parallel paradigmatic is what you find on the right-hand side. So where does this leave us? Next slide, please, Liz. Here you are. If you were a golden retriever, if you have few points, then the chances are that you work in a fairly non-programmatic research tradition, and you are towards the right-hand side, right? And I've chosen the golden retriever, of course, because it is the most sociable of all dogs, right? And it is the one that is needed in order to interpret kind of like everything that is needed in order to do good interpretivist results. You need to be super sociable, you need to be super emphatic, but not necessarily bounded by the rules. On the extreme left-hand side, where you have the good old German Shepherd, that's the one dog that is known for the highest task intelligence. You need to be very clear and very strict on your methods. You need to be very narrow up to a point, if you wish, in terms of self-disciplining yourself to work within a dominant program, trying to do unorthodox stuff in one of the unprogrammatic science fields really doesn't really help that much. The good old border collie who can do everything, of course, the king of all dogs, I might say, but let's not go there, is squarely in the middle. If you are in neither, right, then obviously you need to have a lot of social intelligence, because you may run into more programmatic and less programmatic reviewers on the same paper, and then you need a whole lot of wherewithal to shepherd your paper if you wish through the review process. So where does this leave us? Next one, I would say, is that if you are on the more programmatic sciences, then conventional pre-registration works just fine, right? There's nothing wrong with conventional pre-registration, and it works just fine if you're in the programmatic sciences. If you work in a less programmatic field, then conventional pre-registration has its limits, or it may not work for you at all. That is problematic, right? Because not all of us are in the programmatic sciences, and what you see is that it actually creates a lot of fuzz, a lot of conflict around what pre-registration may actually entail and what it may actually do. So final grand finale for today is my call to arms, if you wish, and that is to step up the search for more epistemically neutral solutions to the pre-registration or research transparency challenge. Final slide, I would say, Liz, thank you so much. So if you are a golden retriever, right, and by all means do know that I love golden retrievers, that I'm arguably one of them myself. I'm not saying anything negative about golden retrievers. It just happens to be the case that some of us, including myself, spend lots of time in less structured communities where research is either in a pre-paradigmatic state or simply refuses to become programmatic. And what does that then mean with respect to pre-registration? And should we simply give up on it and declare it a non-tool for our community? And I would say quite vehemently, no. Because both the epistemic benefits, and we talked about that a little bit today, as well as the benefits in the peer review process, the chances at virtue signaling, at tie breaking, at collective self-binding, but also enhancing traceability by stipulating your point of departure and documenting the journey rather than just the end product, all of those remain very, very real. And so what I would say, and this is, it's the end of a campaign month, but it's the beginning of hard work, I would say, we need to invest, or we commit to, more epistemically neutral alternatives. And so with epistemically neutral alternatives, I mean research transparency tools that work for a variety of research communities, including the non-programmatic ones. I would say we need to sensitize ourselves more and guard ourselves against non-inclusive and dismissive language that can go to and fro. It goes from programmatic to less programmatic, but also from less programmatic to more programmatic research communities, right? The one always calls the other messy, and the other calls the first oftentimes dogmatic, and neither of this is really very helpful. And so we need to, first of all, sensitize ourselves against this type of non-inclusive and dismissive language with respect to our peers in the more programmatic or less programmatic traditions, depending on where we depart from. The second thing that I would like to suggest is that we do need to collectively reflect and document what are these generalizable epistemic functions of pre-registration. So how do they generate more research transparency, and what epistemic benefits do research transparency actually have for all of us? And we need to do that both for the programmatic sciences, for the programmatic research fields, but there it is fairly obvious because pre-registration was developed for and with them, whereas for the non-programmatic research traditions, there's work to do. But rather than, again, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I would invite everyone who's in the non-programmatic sciences, much like myself, to then think as to what then are the epistemic functions that pre-registration or other forms of pre-commitment can actually help to increase the traceability and reconstitutability of our research efforts. This also will have to come with investments in standards, platforms, infrastructure, and practices that then also work in the context of non-programmatic research traditions. It's not just a matter of goodwill. It's also about finding alternatives to the current pre-registration platforms, or also putting some pressure on them and working with them in order to also allow for pre-registration in the non-programmatic sense. And finally, of course, you also must remember that we need to just socialize our junior researchers, of course, into working with pre-registration, especially junior scientists in the non-programmatic traditions, but also our senior scholars who are acting in their capacity as these gatekeepers, as mentors, but also as reviewers and editors, in order to also make them use the benefits and the instruments of pre-registration and research transparency more, even if they are somewhat outside of the broader, even if they are outside of the more programmatic sciences. This was my call to arms. My final slide before I'm going to throw it up is to say thanks to everyone. By all means, let me echo the words of Matthijs earlier on. And in no particular order, let me thank Antonio, Muteleni, and certainly also Liz for their terrific work over this month-long campaign. And by all means, know that you are champions and heroes in my book. Thanks so much, and over to you, Liz.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pursey. I'll stop sharing. That was a great presentation. Thank you. Yes, I was going to ask if there were questions. Antonio, please.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. And also the kind of perspective that I honestly don't hear very often, which is, yeah, great and refreshing. So I'm a Siberian cat, or, you know, like a German Shepherd, if you really want to go in that direction. But I'm a Siberian cat. And I would like to explore a little bit with you the usefulness of registration in self-binding or in reassessing the legitimate requests of reviewers and editors during the reviewing process. And since both you and Matthijs have shared your anecdotes, allow me to share my anecdote. So I had a similar experience, so I could say no to a series of requests from reviewers during the submission of one of my papers, or papers that I co-authored. So, you know, to push back on the usual questions, at least in my field. So what about gender differences? When when people have absolutely no idea what else to ask, they're just going to ask about gender differences. But I could say no and to push back, not because of pre-registration. What made it more convincing was that the data were available. So I could simply say, oh, that's a good idea, but this was not part of the research question. Look it up if you want. These are the data. By all means, if you have any questions, just ask. So with this, I'd like to ask you, so can we really expect pre-registration to fulfill this function of self-binding? Or perhaps responsible open data is more important, or other open research practices? Or perhaps what we have identified right now is the fact that registration becomes more important when other open research practices are more difficult to apply. And so we have like a very nice, you can have your cake and eat it. What do you think?
I would very much love to have our cake and eat it, of course. What I would say is that I think that we are all still far from completely unleashing the full potential of pre-registration or other open science practices, right? I think that pre-registration, I wouldn't say it was developed hastily or kind of in or only in response to a crisis such as the replication crisis in the social sciences and in social psychology in particular, but that has given that did give a pretty big boost in its diffusion. I think that now that we have these tools, I think that we as a community also need to think ourselves, what else can we do with this particular pocket knife, so to speak, right? I mean, we have this pretty versatile tool that so far we have been using only for a very limited set of epistemic benefits. I think in reality, the benefits that can derive from saying, well, I want to pre-register my report, I want to pre-register my design, the benefits there are greater than we currently think. And we do well as a scientific community to think about how we then can roll out more of these benefits, perhaps in a piecemeal manner. So I'm not sure whether self-binding is then the first one that's going to on which we are going to reach consensus, but that's definitely one of the steps in which we can use it more often than what we are currently doing it right now, my dear Siberian.
Thank you so much. There's also a comment in the chat, but I don't know if Petros, do you want to say it yourself? Is it anything, or do you want me to read it? I can. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. This is, I think, even the first experience to hear this terrific and this new from our context. Then I am actually learning. And thank you, Heugens, for infecting us with these insights from our context. You know, when we are designing, you know, such kind of assessment, we simply focus on problem. And then, you know, most of the time, the decision makers who are just deciding on the resource, even resisting, you know, on such kind of research. So I got a lot of, you know, insight. So I want to learn more on that. Either is there, you know, very fresh article which could also serve us a lot in our programmatic research, particularly in the service organizations, much more, you know, focused on policy and the healthcare management issues. So how can I apply this even from the African context as well? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Philibos. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? It doesn't seem like it. Okay, if not, we do have a question that we ask all our presenters. So actually, I want to ask this question to both of you, Pursey and Matthijs. Let's see. So the question is, if you had to choose one open science practice that is necessary to ensure transparency in your field, what would that be? Pursey?
That is a really good question, Liz. If I look at my own field of especially macro management, right? I mean, we a lot of the methods that we use and a lot of the and I'm now not commenting on my more interpretivist research lines, but more on the classic large database type work. I'm a little bit torn between two. One is open data, where we clearly have miles to go, right? And where, for example, our sisters in economics are much further ahead than we are. So open data is an important one, but my vote would go to, and this may not come as a surprise to you, but to open materials. Because in many of our fields, there's a big premium on collecting new data. And then especially the instruments that we use to collect that data oftentimes are poorly disclosed, right? So what were the interview questions? What were the survey protocols? What was the data scraping code that we used in order to collect the data that we are now reporting? And I think that especially in management, the biggest, the lowest hanging fruit is to start sharing more of the instruments that we use to harvest the data that we harvest the new unique data that we work with. So my vote goes to open materials, Liz.
Thank you. Great. And Matthijs?
Well, it's a difficult one. It certainly starts with open, but then I have to choose only one. Well, there can be only one. It's very tempting to choose open data, but actually I'll go for open access. And why? Well, it actually is already with us for over 15 years, but we're still not there yet. And it's such a wonderful thing that everybody can read your research results if you publish in open access. And in our university, it seems self-evident by now, because we're now at a level of 80% in open access, at least on Woudestein. And that's wonderful. So we're doing a great job. So one could say, well, nothing to worry about, we can move on. But actually, I don't think that's the case. We should realize that we're in this tiny privileged pocket in Western Europe. And that there's a whole world out there which really desperately needs access to our research. So, well, I'll opt for open access and hope we can take this extra mile to well, 90, maybe 100%.
Excellent. Thank you. Great. Okay. So thank you both. Thank you both for the talks and their speeches and their presentations. Very, very interesting and nice, and very nice to close this whole campaign with this. Very, very last thing I wanted to show you is just a few, I'm sharing my screen, yes, and I'll share it from the, oh, this is not going to work, 1 second. Yeah. So, okay, I hope you can all see my screen. Yes, thank you. So just to wrap up this campaign, as hopefully you all know, or if you don't, then I'm here to explain it. This Open Science, so this campaign was actually part of a whole Open Science initiative that was started from Pursey and Chrysola. And the whole Open Science initiative is a program that was launched last year and is supposed to last for 3 years. So we still have this year and 1 more year to go. So far we have had, yes, here. Last year we had in March the Orchid Madness Month, and these are QR codes. So when you go to, if you use your phone, it will send you to the link of where all the presentations are there. So everything is public of what happened on that campaign. We then had the October Data Fest last year. Is the same. So we have a collection in our institutional repository, the Erasmus Data Repository, where you see all the presentations. And for now, we are doing the last session on the March Research Transparency campaign. For this session, because we had everything online, we also recorded the sessions and they're all online in YouTube as well. But if you go to this link and the EDR repository, they're also in the description, we'll send you to the link of YouTube as well. And each of their talks individual have a resource at the bottom, which will also send you to the YouTube recording of that session. So this is the, a snapshot of the collection that we have at the EDR, the Erasmus Data Repository, with all the presentations from everyone. And then this is the YouTube channel. So we made a playlist called Research Transparency. So if you just want to go and see all the presentations, then just go to the playlist. I wanted to show you a bit of the impact that we have had so far. So we had 102 in-person attendees. So there were a little bit more registered people, but not everyone that registered comes, but that's 102 people that attended. And then here you see the numbers of the views from the YouTube channels of each of the recordings up to the one on Tuesday. And then in total, this is also the views. So the second line, it says the views of the presentations inside the EDR, the Erasmus Data Repository Transparency Collection. So people actually go and see the presentation, and there's actually a few people downloading the presentations as well. So that is nice. And yeah, so we are at 942 at the moment, which we're very happy with that. And just as what's coming, in this fall, we still have, as I mentioned, there's one more campaign coming, but we're also launching the Open Science MOOC. So hopefully you can all join us on that MOOC, and the Citizen Science campaign that will, as Matthijs very correctly said, this will be an EUR-wide campaign, so not only for ERIM, but everyone is invited. And with that, I think we can close this campaign. I really want to thank Antonio and Mutaleni. It was very, very, very nice working with you. I was very happy. And thank you everyone for joining for the presentations. I hope to see you in the next campaign, which will be in October. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.